It is my pleasure to welcome you to Northern Kentucky History Hour. I am your host for tonight, Mary Jane Calderon, joining you from the third floor in our 1959 Buick Electra. Also joining me is our presenter for this evening, Dawn Weber, and Heather Cook from her dorm in Worcester, Ohio. Thank you both for being here. Northern Kentucky History Hour is a project of Behringer-Crawford Museum, Northern Kentucky's history museum, that would not be possible without support. Thank you to all of our sponsors, including the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, Kentucky Arts Council, Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, the Carol Ann and Ralph V. Hale Jr. Foundation, and our members. If you're not yet a member of the museum, please consider joining for access to discounts and exclusive programming. Learn more and join at bcmuseum.org. We would love to hear from our viewers tonight, so if you have a question or comment to share, please type it in the chat or Q&A feature, and I'll be sure to get to those at the end of the presentation. So let's meet tonight's presenter. Wrong page. Don Weber spent most of his working career covering Northern Kentucky sports from 1986 to 2010, and the Kentucky General Assembly from 2010 to 2018 as a television reporter. As a child, he remembers going to his neighborhood movie theater and drive-ins and being fascinated by the experience. As he grew older, he was also interested in history and the remaining old movie palaces still standing in the United States. That interest carried over to exploring and researching movie theater history in Northern Kentucky. I would also like to add that Don is an amazing volunteer here at the museum with his video expertise. So, before we get started, there is a quiz question for tonight. The first respondent to enter a correct answer in the chat on Zoom or Facebook Live wins a Northern Kentucky History Hour prize, and most importantly, bragging rights. So tonight's question is, what was the last movie that was shown at the Hip Theater in Newport, Kentucky before it closed? So go ahead and please leave those answers in the chat. And then Dawn, if you are ready, we can go ahead and get started.
All right. Well, here we are. I'm in the passenger seat here in our car, but it certainly is my pleasure to be here, Mary Jane. This is something I've always had an interest in, and that is old movie theaters. And it, as you mentioned, it dated back to me going to these theaters as a kid and just being fascinated by it. We went to mainly the Mary Ann Theater, which we'll talk about a little later in Bellevue. And then we went to the drive-ins. I lived in Campbell County, so mainly it was a drive-in in Dayton called the Riverview and one in Cold Spring called the Pike 27. So always interested to look at theater history. Interesting when you break down old, probably pre-1950 movie theaters and where they were in Northern Kentucky. And to answer the question where they were, well, primarily the Covington, Latonia, Ludlow, and Bellevue, Dayton, Newport, and there were a few in Fort Thomas. That probably was 98% of the movie theaters in Northern Kentucky. And we're going to go down the line and talk about many of those places because that's where the population was. You know, there wasn't a ton of population once you went south of those areas. And while there were a few theaters, which we'll get to, there weren't a ton of them. So very few, count on one hand, really. But some were bigger than others. Some were relatively small, and a lot of them started smaller. I do want to point out a book, and we'll let you know more about this book later, which was a great book written by Bob Webster, who was a presenter last time on the So it's called The Balcony is Closed, A History of Northern Kentucky's Long Forgotten Neighborhood Movie Theaters. I know we've got 4 copies, I believe, left in our gift shop, or you can get them from Bob, and we'll have that information later. But certainly it was a lot of research went into that, and it's a great history of Northern Kentucky movie theaters. Interestingly enough, when you talk movie theater history around the country, one name comes to mind, and that's this gentleman, Marcus Lowe. He, of course, from Lowe's, they started the movie theater chain by the 20s. He operated many of the movie palaces around the area. And of course, the Lowe's name, that started the MGM studios as well. So a giant in movie theater, movie history, not just theaters, but movies in general, was Marcus Lowe. Interestingly enough, he was quoted in a article in Cosmopolitan magazine in 1925 talking about how 20 years earlier, he had the idea of operating a movie theater from a man he had visited with in Covington, Kentucky, amazingly enough, back in 1905. And there's several ideas of who that person was. One is I.W. McMahon, the other G. Henry Hackstatt. And those gentlemen operated the Edisonian Annex. We think this is the first one. This, as you see here, this was the first known advertisement for a moving theater, moving picture theater show in Northern Kentucky. The Edisonian Annex, that was located on the second floor at 521 Madison Avenue in Covington. As you see, the movies, the Great Train Robbery, which I think was the first, I believe that was the first movie created back in 1903. I believe that one was made. And then Peck's Bad Boy was your big double header there. A nice, clean show for ladies and children. Even though I did watch the Great Train Robbery, and I think there were about maybe 70 or 80 gunshots within a 10-minute time there. So, but back then it was clean entertainment for ladies and children. The Edisonian Annex. So that is known as far as record-wise of a movie theater in Northern Kentucky. And as I say, it wasn't necessarily a movie theater. And it was building right here on the second floor at 521 Marcus Lowe. Supposedly got his idea to operate a movie theater. And he, from that idea, he started with this empire of movie theaters as well as movie making. Now, there were a number of Nickelodeons, small theaters. They called them Nickelodeons because it cost a nickel to go, so it's pretty easy to figure out why they called them that. Many small theaters, some weren't open real long, maybe a year or two in a lot of cases, especially in Covington, Newport. I think there were some in Bellevue, Dayton, and not going to list all of those really tonight, not going to focus on that. But here's one right here, kind of interesting. This is the Casino Theater. This was located at 7 Pike Street. I think they said that the seat count was like 275 here. This address is where Frank's Old Town Cafe was. For many years, Frank Bonfilio operated this cafe. I ate there numerous times when I worked at the cable company at 717 Madison Avenue. Never realized that was a theater. Now you look at this building and you think, no way that could be, because if you look at it here, this is the current site right here. That's the current site. And you're like, well, no, that doesn't go as high. But what they would do sometimes is they would add on. So you would see, and they would just add on to the top. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself here. But so in this case, that's probably what happened. And we'll go back one more time. You can see that was where 7 Pike Street is. And that's a new restaurant that's opened up since Frank retired. But numerous old theaters like that around the area. And then we had what happened during that time, especially in the early 1900s, is you had live theaters which hosted live entertainment, kind of adapted. When the movies were invented, it's like, let's have some movies there. And this was one theater in Covington. It was called the Hippodrome Theater. And this was the aftermath of that theater. There was a fire there, and it was destroyed January 14th, 1917. Well, they did show movies there at the time. And unfortunately, that theater was destroyed. And unfortunately, that happened to a lot of old movie theaters in Northern Kentucky, especially some smaller ones. They just caught fire, and that was pretty much the end of them. But what happened was it was rebuilt. So the Hippodrome was rebuilt, and now it became the Broadway Theater. Now, when it became the Broadway, it was pretty much exclusively all movies. So after they tore the rest of it down, rebuilt it, the new Hippodrome, then they changed the name to the Broadway. And so that was the theater. And it was there's another shot of it. This was at 7th and let's see here. The address of that was 7th and Washington, I believe. And there's a shot of the area now in Covington. So just a parking lot now. I mean, that theater was long gone. It was torn down in the 50s, so no sign of that now. Here's an ad for one of the more notable movie-only theaters that started in Covington. This is an opening night ad for the Strand Theater. It opened on Friday, November 24th, 1917, located at 132 Pike Street. L.B. Wilson, actually, he was a big man, which I'll talk about this in a little bit. He was a big motion picture exhibitor, wound up owning 5 theaters in Covington, but he purchased this theater in 1928 and then operated it into the 30s. So this is at 132 Pike Street. And you kind of see they put the building information on the big, most of the theaters did that. They did big ads to get people excited about, this is the building today. And if you look at it, you can kind of see from the outside, okay, I can see where that might have been a theater. There is one remnant, though. There is one place where there is still a definite sign of the Strand, and that's right inside the front door. As you look down, there you see Strand. It's in some tile there, and that was the entrance. That was the main entrance into the Strand Theater. That is the one representation of what's left of the old Strand. Now, I mentioned Mr. L.B. Wilson. He was a big motion picture exhibitor in Covington. In fact, he owned 5 of the theaters in northern Kentucky, and he owned the Strand. He wound up buying the Rialto, which was one of those real small theaters. That was at 425 Madison. The Lyric, which we'll get to soon, that was actually the site of the old Madison, and then that Hippodrome Broadway. So he owned 5 of the Covington theaters, and but he built a theater in 1923, which was probably would be Covington's first what you would call movie palace, and that was right here at 6th and Madison, the Liberty Theater. Built in 1923, a lot of different amenities there. The marble lobby, Italian marble lobby. They have Statue of Liberty in the lobby, a mahogany ticket booth, a grand marble and brass staircase, a large pipe organ. Unfortunately, I was not able to find one interior picture of the Liberty. All I've got are exterior pictures. Here's a later picture, which was a color photograph. You can see the marquee. Now, if you look at this picture, though, you're going to say, you know what, especially that looks still very, very familiar, and it should, because this is the look of where the Liberty was. It was torn down for a bank expansion, and you can see right there between the 2 buildings, it's an ATM machine now, but that was originally the Liberty Theater, and so that was, there we go, right there. So that was where the Liberty was. Now it's an ATM, but really everything's gone. There's nothing to that left. So just to let you know there. Now we've got one at the, this is the Lyric Theater. This was on Madison Avenue. And the Lyric Theater, this was a predecessor to the Madison, and we'll get more about the Madison later, but this was the first theater at that location for the Madison Theater, and it was a pretty good size. It was not as big as the Liberty. Liberty, I need to go over, that had over 1,000 seats. That had 1,350 seats, whereas the Lyric didn't have as many, but we'll get to the Madison, and that kind of talks, and we'll talk about more what was there. That turned into the Madison. Here's an artist rendition of the Madison, still standing. Obviously, it's a concert venue, but this was the theater. In this theater, obviously, not as big as the what am I trying to say here? The Liberty, not as big as the Liberty, but still pretty good size. And then they had there you can see that's a shot. Kind of a shot. These are all from the 40s, right when they opened. There's an interior of the Madison Theater, and 1,350 seats in this theater. So pretty good size. And there you get a look from the screen, I guess, back towards, and there was a balcony there. And there on the right, you see the lobby that was the Madison. Here's a renovation they did back in the late 60s. So kind of switched the chairs out since they'd been there for quite a while. And the Madison lasted until 1977. And September 28, 1977, the Madison shut down. and it was actually purchased by the city in 1985. I know a lady by the name of Esther Johnson did buy the theater, had planned on doing a lot, but it seems like nothing had materialized. And then it wound up being reopened. And luckily for the Madison, it was saved. I actually worked across the street from the Madison when I worked at the cable company, and it was just a vacant building, totally vacant. And luckily it was saved, that which usually isn't the story with a lot of these old theaters. Usually, but that's something they started to find more in the 80s and 90s was, you know what? We've got these, we can do some renovations, we can do some things, and we can really make this place a usable place, especially for smaller concerts where, you don't need a 5,000 seat, 10,000 seat arena, but you can have concerts there. And there's quite a few around the area, but that's definitely one. The Madison was kind of the predecessor to that as far as in Northern Kentucky, as far as having concerts there. And certainly nice to see it's still in existence. There you see the marquee. It's all been renovated, the box office, and just it's neat what they're able to do. Of course, they've done the lights, they've redid them to a point, but it's still really neat exterior. Kind of shows the kind of the way the old theaters were back in the day. So those were the ones primarily in the heart of downtown Covington, which was kind of the big center. That was, got to remember back then, all the stores, the big department stores, everything. That was where the shopping, this was long before Florence Mall. This is where people in Northern Kentucky came to shop, is they either shopped on Madison Avenue in Covington or Monmouth Street in Newport. And we'll get to those in a little while, but that's where we go. Now we're going to go to Main Strasse on Main Street. This building should look very familiar. This is an old picture here, but it was the Family Theater. And that was at 633 Main. And that operated from 1916 and closed in the mid-50s. And if you say, yeah, that does look familiar. It wasn't a huge theater. This would be classified as a neighborhood theater, so not a ton of seats, but certainly enough to, probably in the 500 to 600 range, somewhere around there, 400, 500, 600. And then here's a look at it today. So you can see very similar, very few differences whatsoever. And it's now a music store, the Village Theater, and so another one of those, Mary Jane, where they took a theater and said, you know what, let's make a kind of a showplace out of it. And I think that's kind of neat. They were able to do that, and they've done that in several. They've done a lot around the country too. Covington did have some neighborhood theaters as well. Now we're over in the West Covington area. This is the Shirley Theater. This is the one, 1813 Holman Street, opened on January 31st, 1925. North of 36 was the first movie. This closed in the early 50s. But another thing that happened to a lot of these churches, or a lot of these theaters, is they became churches. This is a renovation. And this renovation, ironically, leads us to the picture of it when it was a church. Well, here's a lobby of it when it was a theater, but then you go from a screen. So as you can see, while it was a neighborhood theater, still a pretty neat place. I mean, pretty kind of like an Art Deco style auditorium. And then there we get a shot, another exterior shot. This is probably more from the 50s here, I would guess. Probably close to when they shut down. And then there you see the exterior. They got a cross in the front. But it's a theater. It's now a church, and that really worked out because what they wound up doing was you had all that open space, so you could, it was a great place to have services. And a lot of old theaters did become churches, which was good for the theater because it kept them from closing. It kept them from demolition. So that's one thing that the churches and I guess performing arts centers have been the savior of old movie theaters. In most cases, if it's not one or the other, it's probably torn down or it was gutted to the point where there aren't much in terms of being able to tell it was a theater. This was in Ludlow, or I'm sorry, this was in Latonia, and there were several theaters in Latonia. Here's an old photo at 40th and DeCourcy. This was the Broadway Theater, and this was actually, or the Delby Theater is originally, and it was closed in 1924 by a fire. April 22nd, 1924, a fire hit it, destroyed the building. And unfortunately, that was it for that. But that was kind of an old style theater, very similar to some of the old style theaters. And this is the building that replaced it. And you look at it now, this theater lasted, again, this location is 40th and DeCourcy. It was a new brick building, and it was called the Derby. So they changed it from the Delby to the Derby. And that operated into the 30s. And then that shut down. Now, there was an old theater in Latonia. It was called the Latonia Theater, ironically, in 1931. It was owned by Louis Wheathy, and it closed in 1939. Now, there's just a parking lot today. The reason I bring that up, though, again, is another one of those small theaters, but this Mr. Wheathy built this theater, the Kentucky Theater. This is on DeCourcy. I'm sorry, not DeCourcy. It is 30. I'm sorry. Yeah, it is 3628 DeCourcy. And this has 800 seats and a pretty grand entrance there. As you see, you've got the Kentucky on the marquee. You got the K on the marquee. You've got Kentucky and light, and that all would light up in the evening. So very spectacular sight in the evening. Take a look at that. And you see the marquee, you got the lights, and there's still remnants of this left. Now, inside, there's nothing. It's a fabric store today. So there's not really anything inside that you would notice as far as being a theater. I think there's apartments too, but there you get a look. You can see where the Kentucky marquee is here. There you go, right there, and that is above the marquee, where the marquee would be. Obviously, it's gone now, but I mean, yeah. So you can see that there's an exterior of it. So very easy to see how that was a theater as well back in the day, and so that was Covington and Latonia. So, and as I say, that's kind of where the theaters were, but that's where the population was, so that's kind of the big thing of when they did these theaters. They built them where the people were, not that people that lived out there were people still, of course, lived in Independence or whatever, but it was pretty far out and not enough to support a movie theater. So that's how Alexandria really had no movie theaters. They pretty much all, went to these populated areas which are close to the river. Now we're going to venture over until staying in Kenton County. We're going to go to Ludlow, and here's a exterior shot of the Elm Theater. This again was a pretty simple theater. It's at 235 Elm Street, capacity of 500. This would have been built probably in the early 30s is when this one came into existence, late 20s, early 30s. And nothing really other notable to talk about other than this was the theater that was in Ludlow. It was a go-to theater in Ludlow until this one came about. This is the Ludlow Theater. The Ludlow Theater was at 322 Elm, just down the street. And here's an artist rendition of that theater. That theater was built in the 40s, and actually they were in business till the early 70s as a movie theater. Here's a picture. This picture I know is from 1975, and the reason I know that, the bottom line, Class A champs. Ludlow won the state football title in 1975. So this is a shot of the theater in the mid-70s. So it was still in business as of 1975. I think it went into the late 70s when they finally shut her down. But this theater, sad. It was I think it was a factory or something where a business worked out of there for many years. Luckily, it became a performing arts center, and this is a current shot of the exterior. Really neat, neat things there going on there. The theater, the great thing with that is it keeps it from deteriorating, because a lot of these theaters, what's happened, if there isn't a lot going on and it just sits there, the roof goes. Once the roof goes, the clock's ticking, because sometimes they just get too far gone. The cost to fix the roof is just too much, and they wind up getting torn down.
Those are our friends at Burkus.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's just a neat place. Neat. I just like the marquee, and that was renovated. I think it may have been recreated because that marquee was gone for a long time. So unless they were able to save the letter, I'm not sure exactly, but as you can see, they had a lot of different things there, but you can easily see it was a theater, and it still is a theater, but it's a performing arts center, which for Ludlow, that's great to have a performing arts center in a town of their size. nice place for people to go to. So this is one of the happy stories of old theaters. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of happy stories in some cases, but certainly in Ludlow, it's worked out. Now, as I said, 98% were in the river towns. There are a couple that weren't in Northern Kentucky, several. And we're going to look at the next one. Before I do that, the box office. This is the Ludlow box office. And back then, the key thing was it was showmanship. That's what they want to do. I mean, look at this box office, especially when you look at what the old theaters and current ones are. I mean, this one, you got tile on all over above where the window is, below it. And they just wanted to create that experience of someplace special to go to. And that's exactly what, that was kind of the purpose of when they all had the tiles. A lot of times, even on the ground, you'll see tiles. Some of the old movie palaces still feature a lot of that. So kind of cool how they have all that. But that's an example that even in a town the size of Ludlow had a movie theater that still had a lot of decoration on it. So very neat there. This is in Fort Mitchell. So this was a theater called the 4-Star Dixie, located at 2497 Dixie Highway. It opened on August the 14th, 1940, and it closed just 11 years later. So this theater, Mary Jane, didn't have a long life, unfortunately, 11 years, but it kind of, when you in the 50s, that's when a lot of these started to go under, and various reasons for that. Television was starting to come along, although this was a little before most of the theaters started going. So not totally sure why this was such a short-lived theater. Probably as far as actual movie theaters. Now, the Nickelodeons, a lot of those only lasted a couple years, but this one only lasted 11 years. That's kind of surprising. There we get some of the movies that did show there. And but there's a little wider shot, and this will give you a perspective with the current shot.
Yeah, I never knew about this theater, but when I saw this picture, I was like, I know exactly where that is.
Yeah, because you recognize the other buildings there, and we will go. There we go. So you can kind of see where it was. Now, you can look at that building now. There's nothing that I see there that resembles what a theater would have been. Excuse me. And that happens sometimes. I mean, sometimes the renovation is so complete. This one, though, it hasn't been a theater in 70 plus years. So it was a bank. And I know then it went under extensive renovation. So I think it went under extensive renovation for the bank. It went under extensive renovation for what's there now. So that's kind of changed the whole thing to where you would not know. Some of these buildings you would look, and if you're observant enough, you'd say, I could see where that was a theater. This you wouldn't. I mean, I think unless you knew, you would not suspect that at all. Then we're going to go to Ellesmere. This was another place that actually had a theater. This was back in the 20s. They had a theater there. It was called the Gaiety, 3615 Dixie Highway. It was built in 1914, and it operated until 1938. And kind of a maybe not the greatest shot in the world, but still, it's from an old newspaper clipping, and but still kind of a basic theater. Interesting how looks like you've got, air throwing through it. So there was no air conditioning back in some of those old theaters. So it got kind of hot, but there you can kind of get a look at and see what it was. Now we follow that up with the second theater they built. This one will be familiar to a lot of folks, especially if you're 40 or maybe age 40, 45 or older. This was the second Gaiety Theater. And it actually wound up being the Village Cinemas, which operated well into, I think, maybe the early 90s, I think, is the Village. But I would go there. They would have, dollar shows. So I actually went to the Village a couple of times. It was a little bit of a trek from where I lived, which was on Dayton Pike in Campbell County. But I would venture over there a couple of times. They would show some movies, usually for like $1. And that's what happened in those theaters. Originally, they showed first-run movies, but as time went on, especially when the big showcase cinemas and the Florence cinemas came about, these theaters became relegated just showing second-run movies, which wasn't awful because you could see a movie for $1, as opposed to spending a lot more going to the other theaters. So it was neat to do that. But this theater, I mean, it was pretty well taken care of, and it lasted, like I say, I think into the early 90s. And then before it shut down, you see a ticket stub from that. And as I said, $1. That was pretty much what they were there even at the end. So there we go. And then let's see here. Then we had, okay, there we go. Now we're going to go to Walton. So we're going to go to Boone County for one right now. And that was the theater called the James Theater. This was on US 25 in North Walton, north of the town there. And it was in town, but this theater was actually a Ford garage before it was a theater. So a lot of times some of these theaters get converted into garages or whatever. This is listed as having a Ford garage before it became a theater, but this was the James. This was a theater. There you get a look. A lot of these theaters, what they would do is pass out these little cards or little pamphlets that would have the shows like coming up for the next couple of weeks. So you could go and check all that out. The neat thing to do there. Here's a later color shot of the James Theater, and that's always. And so it became an IGA store. We had some lights go out. Hey, we just keep going. We just keep going, That's right. And so after the theater closed, and I want to say that closed probably in the early 70s, early to mid 70s, became an IGA store. There you see a picture of that IGA store that wound up. And then at that point, that store closed and it was being torn down. There's a gas station there today. So that was the lone theater at the time, indoor theater in Boone County before the Florence cinemas were built, was the James Theater in Walton. So kind of interesting there. And now we're going to go over to Campbell County. And as I said, that was a lot of old theaters in Campbell County. You got to remember, that's where the population was based, the Covington, Latonia area, and then Bellevue, Dayton, Newport. I mean, that was that's where the congregation of people were in Northern Kentucky. Therefore, that's where the theaters were. There was an old Nickelodeon started early on in Bellevue. And here was another one founded by Pete Smith, who was the showman. He was the theater man in Bellevue. Okay, so the next three theaters I'm going to talk about, which were all the main theaters in Bellevue, Pete Smith was the operator of those, and his family operated them all many years after he passed. So, but the Avenel was the first one. This was built in 1914. And you see it there. It's called the Avenel Social Club when this picture was taken, but that was an old Nickelodeon theater. And it was, so that's what they had to, so the building on the right is still there. So that's still standing. And there you see it right there. It's an apartment complex. So if you look at the front, there's nothing about that front. I mean, well, I guess you could look at it and see the roof's pointing. So that might be the one sign that's still there, but there's nothing there that you would see them. It's all made in apartments. It's all been divided up. But there is one little sign of that theater, and that is on the right side of the building. You see the old yellow brick, which was, that would have been on the front too. So that was the brick that the theater, the original theater had. So that building was originally, I remember it as a kid, before it was renovated into apartment, it was all yellow brick like that. And I think it was like a small factory that was that. And so that theater operated until 1929 when Pete Smith built the Sylvia Theater. This is at 318 Fairfield Avenue. So this is a shot of the Fairfield back in the day. And so again, this was his second theater. And this theater operated until April 25th, 1942. Here's a current shot of it. So as you can see, I like to look at this. Very similar, very few changes whatsoever, except maybe the entrance. But it's an antique store now, but that was the second. So that's the second still standing old movie theater in Bellevue. So Pete Smith got rid of the Sylvia, shut it down the night before. He opened this theater. This is the opening night ad for the Marianne Theater, still standing on Fairfield Avenue in Bellevue. Capacity 700. This theater lasted, this was the last neighborhood theater that still operated in Northern Kentucky. It operated into the 90s. I went to a show there in the mid 90s. this was actually my go-to theater as a kid. It was the closest operating movie theater still in existence. Went to many shows there. I mean, heck, I can remember as a kid, they would show a first-run movie, but they'd show 2 showtimes. They'd show them at 7 o'clock and maybe one at 9 o'clock. I'd have my mom and dad drop me and my sisters off. We'd say, just come back and get us about 11. You know, it'd be in the summer, so we weren't working. But it's like, I watched the same movie twice. You know, they didn't really scoot you out or anything. So that is what they did. And it was a fantastic experience. Neighborhood theater. One of the things I remember, here's a shot of it now. As you can see, just a beautiful exterior. And it was an Art Deco style. There you can kind of see around the box office there. They have the tile, the different colors there. Probably the most remarkable thing about this theater was the exterior. Art Deco interior, but not I wouldn't really call it a movie palace, but it was a really attention getter, and that's the biggest thing. A lot of these theaters, that's what they want to do, is get your attention. This building will get your attention more than any building in Bellevue, I think. Still, I mean, this is a current picture, so this is what it looks like. I mean, the one thing I can remember of this theater, you're in there, and sometimes as kids, you get to talking too much, and, watching a movie, you might be chatting, although I usually watch the movies. I didn't, but they patrol the aisles, and if you were talking too much, they'd warn you, and if you kept talking, boom, you were out of there. So he ran a strict ship in terms of, and I believe that was it would have been his son, I think Lou Smith would have run it by then. But certainly it was always clean, and it was a great place to go. I know Sundays they'd usually have double features. Went to many of those, but just a neat place to go. And that theater is still standing. Unfortunately, nothing's really been done. I don't know what kind of shape the interior is in, because unfortunately the interior hasn't been used in probably 30 plus years or close to that. So that's kind of worry about that. What may happen is they can wind up using that entrance, and then maybe something, even if they have to rebuild it behind it. Sometimes they'll do that with theaters. They'll take that entrance, because that entrance is beautiful. And the entrance is pretty much restored. I mean, the entrance looks as good now as it probably would have back in the 60s. So, but the inside probably a little rough, but it remains to be seen what'll become of the Mary Ann. But certainly that is one that we certainly would hope anyway that it could be something could be done with that theater, because a lot of memories for me. I mean, that's obviously one of the big things. I want to go to the neighboring town of Dayton. As you look at this, okay, this was just a garage, but at one time when it was built, it was the casino. They called it the casino, and then the Liberty Theater in Dayton. This is 508 Berry Street. This was built by Woodrow Bressler. So he was the Pete Smith of Dayton. He was the movie guy, and so he created this theater. And it operated into the 40s. It closed in 1941. In fact, it closed in June of 1941. But that wasn't the end of movies in Dayton, because Woodrow Bressler decided, I'm going to build a bigger theater. And here's a full-page ad. Again, they did that for a lot of the theaters. And what'd they call it? The Dayview Theater in Dayton, Kentucky. It opened on June 26, 1941. Jerome and Woodrow Bressler brothers were the co-owners. The capacity of this theater, 750. And I may have been in this when I was very young. I think it closed in the mid-60s. So it wasn't around a ton of time when you think about it. I mean, I don't know if it was open 25 years. I don't think it was. Between 20 and 25 years, I guess. But this theater, of course, the biggest feature of this is the big the blue arch, which is still there, not in 100% shape, but it is still there and still very noticeable. Here's the front of the theater, kind of a typical theater, kind of similar to Mary Ann to a point. You got your marquee, you got your doors, and so you got the movie posters there you see in front there on the left. And then this is a current shot. So as you can see, for the most part, the big blue arch is still there, and you kind of see where the marquee was. The Cobb Group is listed there. So it is still a business. And again, it's kind of one of those things that the theater has pretty much been gutted. There probably are some remnants inside. I would guess was not able to get inside, but at the same time, at least it's a business and it's operating. So as long as that You got to figure it's safe from the old wrecking ball. So that's a win in terms of an old movie theater still standing. And it is kind of interesting how many are still standing around the area. Now, here's an area. Now we're going to move to Fort Thomas. And this shot is on it's River Road and South Fort Thomas Avenue. The building on the right is still there. Not sure about this, where that actually the Fort Theater. It looks to be in the exact location, and even the wall there is angled like what this garage is, but I don't think it's the same building. The bricks look too new, so I think that theater was basically demolished, and this building was put in there. But as you can see, the Kaufman Realty building still there. So it was there back then. But the Fort Theater, now that was a theater that was built by the Fort Thomas military base. So most of your audience for that theater, I'm sure, were servicemen that came that were stationed in Fort Thomas. They had a theater they could walk to from where that was. So that was I'm sure that was a good business strategy to locate that there. Another one that was this building, which was new to me. I had no idea this was a theater as much as I thought I knew Fort Thomas. But it was kind of a short-lived theater, only there from 1930. It was originally called the Chinese Garden, then just shortened to the Garden Theater. And it's listed to have been in operation from 1930 to 1941. Again, I think it was one of those theaters that served the military post there in Fort Thomas. And now they call it the Post. So it's kind of a get-together place. But back then, it was actually a old movie theater. And then probably the Marquee Movie Theater, the biggest theater was no doubt the biggest theater in Fort Thomas, was this building, the Highland Theater, located on North Fort Thomas Avenue. This building is still there, the Highland Theater building, and it is still a business. This theater stayed in business until the early 70s. I want to say, but I think by the mid 70s, it had pretty much closed. But they did a pretty good crowd in Fort Thomas. Obviously, a lot of people were in walking distance there, and it was a neat. Never did have the pleasure of going in this theater, but certainly it did draw people.
I want to point out that you told me that you think adult film, but it's not necessarily
right.
Adult film.
It says adult film. This wasn't a Cinema X. I think what it was, it's like, okay, it's not a G-rated film, but it wasn't. They didn't deal like in porn or whatever. No, it was just I think this is a film society. They have a film there. So yeah. I want to make that clear for what was what was in there. But sometimes they did those kind of things to keep the theater going too, because again, they weren't getting first run movies and second run movies. And by then you had these big cinemas opening up. So they did what they could. And sometimes they were able to do that. They were keep it going, but it was only for so long. And this is the Highland Theater building today. As you can see, you can kind of look and see the building is somewhat similar a little bit, but without the marquee and everything. There is one sign though, really cool what they did here, because that's the exterior. And you say, are there any remnants of the old theater inside? Because it's all been gutted. It's all, office spaces and that. The answer to that question is yes. And it's when you go in where the original lobby is, the poster case, they've got all the businesses in that building. Very cool thing to do to kind of, one, it shows, hey, it's making use of something that was there. And again, those poster cases, really cool. You got them now showing, and it's all the businesses located in the Highlands. So I think a great hats off to the current owners there to do what they did there, because I think that was a really neat thing to do. Now we're going to go through Newport. Ironically, Newport is one place where none of the old theaters are still standing, the old neighborhood theaters. They've all been demolished. Here was one that actually started out as a live show. As I said, a lot of those did. This was up on 11th in York. It was opened in the 1880s. And first time I heard about this was my grandfather had mentioned, he had gone to some shows there. And but it was, again, they had live shows there. And then once the movies came about, they started showing movies. Again, as you see there, it's a nickel. So 5 cents to go to the movies, and you're able to do that. There was the interior, and again, you kind of see it's more of a live entertainment complex than a theater, or movie theater, but certainly, not too shabby. And then that's a shot of it today. It actually was part of the Trout complex, Trout Dairy. but they've closed down, and it's just kind of a business warehouse there now. But no sign that that theater ever existed there at all. So just some shots of kind of what it looked like. This was on 6th and Monmouth, Temple Theater, a pretty good sized theater, but for the most, it opened in 1910 and closed in 1931. Not a lot of information on this one, but it was a theater that was in Newport, fairly sizable, not huge, but fairly sizable theater that was in Newport. And then we go to the Colonial, which is 943 Monmouth. This one had a short life. It was open in 1911, closed in 1921 because it was condemned. My guess is bad construction, shoddy construction. I mean, it only lasted 10 years and it gets condemned. My goodness. But it's just a parking lot area there now. And so that's what's left there. This was the Strand Theater. This was at up on 827 Monmouth Street. They advertised all talk movies, and it operated from 1916 into the 50s. And there you get a look at the old marquee, and you say, well, what's there today? Well, remember what I said. It tore everything down. So that's just a parking lot there for the Strand. Next up, one of the largest theaters in Northern Kentucky, which was the Hip Theater, short for the Hippodrome, 2,500 seats. So this was the largest theater that was in Northern Kentucky at the time. This one on Monmouth Street, a lot of people, in the 50s and early 60s, closed in the early 60s. With our trivia question, the last movie there was filmed in 1962. It was released in 1962. So there's a hint on that. But
you can go ahead and answer it because we had a winner.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, it was. Why don't you answer it? Because I didn't write down. It was the Three Stooges in orbit or something like that.
Yes, the Three Stooges in orbit.
Okay, very good.
We'll get to that.
Very good. Yes, and we can thank Bob Webster for that because it was in his book. And again, as I talk about this book, and we'll talk about it at the end. If you have any interest in movie theaters in Northern Kentucky at all, you got to get this book. It is great. It's very well done. Documents pretty much all the old theaters in Northern Kentucky. A lot of good information. What did the Hip become? This parking lot. And on the right is Dixie Chili, just to give you some perspective of where that is. Just a parking lot. Then came the State Theater. And this theater, again, this was a small theater. This was probably one of the smaller of the three, certainly smaller than the Strand, smaller than the Hip. But this was located on 713 Monmouth, or no, I'm sorry, 716 Monmouth Street, so close across the street from the Hip. But that later became more famous as Cinema X. The State showed, I know they got to the point in the early 70s, they were just open on weekends, so they weren't open a lot, but they became Cinema X, and they were notorious. They were actually rated in 1973, because they pretty much showed X-rated movies, got rated in 1973 for showing, well, it's a family show, so I'm not going to go over the title it was showing, but you're welcome. But yeah, they wound up shutting it down. Finally did shut it down, and because they kept getting rated and kept getting, and that was enough. So Cinema X was no more, and it was torn down. And I'll give you one guess. What's at Cinema X now, or the State / Cinema X? Another parking lot. So it did. The demolished theaters did do a lot for parking on Monmouth Street. It opened up quite a few spots. Now we're going to go one more theater in Newport that actually the building is still there, but this kind of breaks this goes into a new era of movie theaters. In 1970, Newport basically had the first modern, what you would call multiplex, even though it was only 2 theaters operated. This was the entrance to it. It was the Newport Plaza Cinemas at the Newport Plaza in Newport. And here is a shot of the interior, or here's an exterior. You break eye fix, and you say, well, is there any sign that I guess not, of when it was an old theater? Basically, it was 2 small auditoriums. Weren't overly huge, 334 seats, 327 seats. The company that ran it, American Theaters in America, actually went bankrupt a year later, but they did stay in operation until 1981. This is a theater I went to. I would go to this one to check out some old movies. One thing notable about this theater was, quite frankly, you could see some R-rated movies if you were under 18, and they still let you in. They didn't really check ID. So Not that I ever did that. Not that I ever did that, but it was yeah. I remember seeing The Exorcist there and actually leaving thinking it was a comedy when I walked out of there. It struck me as a comedy where other people were like terrified. It's like, well, whatever. Anyway, okay, get on the. I'm getting off subject here. Okay, there is a sign that the theater is still there, and it's this is a shot from the hill. Look behind, you see the area there. Let's see here. I'm trying to show you. It's up here. Well, I went too far. Here we go. I'm getting too ahead here. That's all right. Here we go. Right here. Okay. That's where the two auditoriums were. Okay. So, and it's kind of like bluish gray or whatever, but that's where the auditoriums were. So that's the sign. When you look, you got that those theaters, which were a lot of theaters. You have that real narrow entrance, and then you've got that big opening there, and that's where the theaters were. You obviously the ceiling fire and everything else. So the sign that it was a theater is still there. So, and so that was the first modern theater built in Northern Kentucky, and really the first theater that was built in Northern Kentucky in probably 30 plus years. So that created, and that started the modern multiplex. And that was followed by this one, the Showcase Cinemas, which most people are still familiar with. I think that opened in Erlanger on December 20th, 1974. Here was the opened with 5 screens, and they added 8, 3 more actually to come up with 6, and or 8 total screens in 1976. It closed in 2008. This is the memory of a lot of folks. I'm sure for you, Mary Jane, and me too. This was the theater. This was kind of the go-to theater. You go in there, what movie we're going to see. You looked up at the ticket booth there, which was all inside. It wasn't a booth per se. It was all inside, open area. And you looked and you kind of saw, okay, what movie am I going to watch? Okay, a concession stand for all the overpriced concession things. I used to sneak a lot in there. I'd get some candy and just put it in my pocket. Really,
those prices are a lot lower.
A lot lower than they were, but they were still pretty high back in the day. But yeah, I usually snuck it in. So as well as liquor refreshment. Yeah. Okay. All right. And then the second one, which was, again, this one should be familiar to a lot of folks too. This was the Florence Cinemas. So it was the Lowe's Florence Cinemas. And this opened actually on December 22nd, I believe. Yeah, 1976. Closed on September of 2008, demolished in 2013. Showcase was demolished in 2015. A lot of people probably remember that, but yeah, here's Lowe's, and again, similar, the old narrow auditoriums, nothing really fancy about any of them. And then these theaters became outdated because of the stadium seating became a big deal. So that kind of, that ended these. And there have been theaters after this, but they're all more modern era theaters, which I'm really not going to go over because wouldn't have time to do it anyway. Still trying to get everything in. But that is where, as far as the indoor theaters, that is kind of a survey of everything. Now, the other thing that happened was outdoor drive-in theaters became a big deal back in the 40s. Some people, now they think if you can go to drive-in, I know there's the Starlights over on the east side, Amelia, I think. Then there's the Holiday, I think it's still open over in northern part of Cincinnati. But you think, okay, you turn on the radio and you hear the sound. Well, back then you had speakers, you had stands, you had speakers, and what those speakers did, you clipped those onto your window, right, like that. And you think if you did that today, a car would probably break a window. It probably would, but I think the glass was a lot better made back in the day. So that's that. There you see the kid there showing the speaker. That was the post. Now this is our collection here, taken from our right. About 5 feet from where I'm sitting here, Mary Jane and I are sitting. That's the speakers from a drive-in. And so that's what you did. Now, in addition to that, they had heaters as well. So there were a couple drive-ins. I know the Pike 27 and I think the Florence. The Riverview in Dayton wasn't, which I'll get to. But so you had heaters.
But this is a speaker.
But this is a speaker, right. The heater would have been smaller. But again, you clipped it on your window. And then because some drive-ins were open year-round, you think about it, it's 10 degrees out. People still went to the drive-in back then. Probably not many, but they did. And you could raise the window up. As a family, I can remember going to the drive-in in the winter, but you raise it up and it would heat the car fairly decently. So that is, that's a speaker. This was the Florence. So this was the first drive-in to open. And this was out on Dixie Highway. And right now it was July 3rd, 1947. There you see the movies. And it was really kind of cool setting. There's the marquee there, and there you see the drive-in, the screen there, and kind of a colonial style, a little bit, I guess. And there's the concession stand, which was always a fun place to go. And as kids, you'd say you have to go to the bathroom, and if you didn't, because you go there and you try to see if you can get a snack.
And you can see the speakers.
And you see the speakers there, yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, but I do remember the heaters. Those were interesting that they did. Interesting, and people would still not think twice about going to a drive-in that time. So, all right. So then next up, we got the Dixie Gardens. Now, this opened on July 3rd, 1947. And so here's the sign. The unique thing about the Dixie, you used to be able to see it from I-75, and then that's the entrance in there. There was an ice bowl right next door to it, so you go ice skating too. So you could not only go to the drive-in, you can go ice skating. So that's very unique. Now they did show movies. The one thing is, though, their screen faced I-75. Kenton County prosecutors kind of raised some stink there because they were showing a movie called Barbarella. Apparently, it's an R-rated movie, and there were accidents on I-75 because people were looking at the screen and not looking at the highway. So I guess they put a kibosh on that, but yeah. So that was the Dixie Gardens, and that operated well into the 80s. I mean, I had gone there a couple times, not many. There's one in Dayton, Riverview. It's where the marina is now in Dayton. Don't really have any other photos or anything of that, but this was in Dayton. And again, this was kind of one of my two go-to drive-ins because the river is 5 minutes from my house. So we would go down there, watch movies. And one of the death knells of drive-ins was honestly daylight savings time, because once that changed back in the 60s, instead of movies being able to start at 8:15, 8:30, they had to start at 9 or 9:30. So the games went late. The only thing I remember about the Riverview, we went there to see Mary Poppins as kids, but they showed another movie first, kind of a risque movie first before Mary Poppins. So Mary Poppins didn't start till about 11:30, 11:45. I was the only one that stayed up and watched the whole thing. So that was kind of a interesting thing. The last drive-in I'm going to talk about is the Pike 27. This was the opening ad. And it was the last drive-in built October of 1954, closed in the mid-80s. And with the Pike 27, there you kind of see the marquee at the bottom there. That's very much a replica of what that marquee looked like. And what they would do is pass out these little schedules when you go into the box office, showed the movies coming up. So I always like to collect these. You kind of look and see, and oh man, look at these movies we got coming up: Invasion of the Saucer Men and War of the Colossal Beast. You can't beat that. So yeah, Marilyn Monroe, but those were always neat. I always enjoyed collecting that kind of stuff. And that was that. And they weren't the only one. I think a lot of them did that. This is where the marquee was. That is where that was now, this current shot. And then on the other side of the lake is where the drive-in was. It's now an apartment complex. There is one sign of that drive-in still there, and it's just right here. It's the entrance road that is where the drive-in was. So it's no longer being used. You can see the weeds grow up, but that's where it was. So that was the drive-in. Do want to, again, Bob Webster, this is his book. We've got 4 copies left in our gift shop, or you can go to bobtheauthor.com. If you have any interest in Northern Kentucky movie theaters, this is your Bible. The Balcony is Closed, A History of Northern Kentucky's Long Forgotten Movie Theaters. It is a fantastic book and just a great, very much a wealth of information on Northern Kentucky movie theaters in one place. So very appreciative of Bob for creating that book.